Every year, sometime around late January or early February, well-meaning beekeepers across the northern hemisphere slide open the lid of a hive that survived December and January, and they place a protein patty on the top bars. The intention is support. The result, far more often than most will admit, is destabilization. The colony that was conserving energy, clustering tightly, rationing its stores with the precision that millions of years of evolution built into its behavior, suddenly receives a chemical signal that spring has arrived, but spring has not arrived, and what follows is not growth. It is a metabolic crisis with a narrow window of survival. Have you experienced this in your own hives? A colony that looked strong in February, dead by mid-March, with frames of chilled brood and almost no remaining honey? If that scenario sounds familiar, this breakdown will explain exactly why it happens. If this kind of biology-first analysis is useful to you, IA-like helps this reach other beekeepers who need it. That February patty, that well-intentioned square of pollen substitute pressed onto wax paper, does not simply feed bees. It triggers a cascade. It tells the queen that protein resources are available. It tells nurse bees that larval nutrition is secure, and in response, the queen begins to lay. Not cautiously, not gradually. She lays in response to the signal she has received, which is abundance. Within days, the brood nest begins to expand. And this is where the danger begins. To understand why this is so dangerous, one has to understand a single biological mechanism that governs everything about late winter colony survival: thermoregulation of brood. A cluster of bees without brood can contract. It can tighten into a dense ball, conserving heat with extraordinary efficiency. The core temperature of a broodless winter cluster can drop to around 70 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes lower, and the bees survive because they are not maintaining anything other than themselves. Their metabolic demand is low, their honey consumption is measured, their survival margin is wide. The moment brood is present, everything changes. Brood must be maintained at approximately 95 degrees Fahrenheit, give or take a degree and a half. That is not a suggestion. That is a biological requirement. Developing larvae and pupae are extraordinarily sensitive to temperature fluctuation. A drop of even 4 or 5 degrees for a sustained period can result in chilled brood, which means dead or deformed bees. The colony knows this. The moment eggs are laid and larvae begin developing, the cluster cannot contract. It must expand to cover the brood. And that expansion demands energy, enormous amounts of energy, strong colony, weak margin. Here is the critical arithmetic that most February feeding decisions ignore. A colony consuming honey to maintain a broodless cluster through winter might use roughly 4 to 5 pounds of honey per month during the coldest period. That is a sustainable rate for a colony that entered winter with 40 to 60 pounds of stores. But once brood rearing accelerates, honey consumption can double or even triple. A colony that was burning through its reserves at a manageable pace is now consuming stores at a rate that assumes incoming nectar or pollen, neither of which exists in February across most temperate climates. What most beekeepers misunderstand is this: the patty does not replace the energy cost it creates. A protein patty provides protein, which stimulates brood rearing, but brood rearing requires carbohydrates, which means honey, to fuel the thermoregulation that keeps that brood alive. The patty creates demand. It does not meet it. The colony now needs more honey than it did before the patty was placed, and in most cases, no additional honey has been provided. The beekeeper has triggered an expansion without funding it. This is not a modern problem. Historical beekeeping literature from the early 20th century is filled with cautious references to the dangers of early stimulative feeding. Beekeepers working fixed-comb skeps in Northern Europe understood, through generations of painful observation, that colonies which began rearing brood too early were the colonies most likely to starve in March, as they did not have protein patties. But they had the equivalent temptation: early sugar feeding, crushed comb placed near the cluster, or simply opening the hive on a warm February afternoon, which could itself stimulate activity. The principle was the same. Stimulation without sustained resources leads to collapse, more bees, less honey. The timing window that makes February feeding so treacherous is not random. It is defined by the gap between brood stimulation and reliable natural forage. In most temperate regions of the United States, the first significant natural pollen sources, typically willows, maples, and early blooming trees, do not become reliably available until sometime between mid-March and early April, depending on latitude. That gap, the 4 to 6 weeks between a February patty and the first real pollen flow, is the kill zone. It is the period during which the colony is running a metabolic engine designed for spring while trapped in winter conditions. Consider the mechanics in detail. The beekeeper places a protein patty on February 1st. Within 3 to 5 days, the queen's laying rate begins to increase. By February 10th, there may be several hundred new eggs and young larvae in the brood nest. By February 15th, the cluster has expanded to cover these developing cells. The colony's honey consumption has already increased significantly. By February 20th, the first round of capped brood is demanding consistent 95 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures across an expanding area. And then, on February 22nd, the temperature outside drops to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. The cluster cannot contract. The brood is there. The bees must cover it. They must vibrate their flight muscles to generate heat. They must consume honey to fuel that vibration. And if the cold snap lasts 5 days or 7 or 10, the colony may exhaust its accessible honey reserves, not because it was weak, but because it was made artificially strong at the wrong time. If you value biology-based beekeeping, consider subscribing. This does not mean protein supplementation is inherently harmful. It means that the decision to feed protein in late winter must be governed by a specific set of conditions, and those conditions are far narrower than most beekeepers realize. The first condition is store assessment. Before any protein patty is placed, on the colony's remaining honey stores must be evaluated. A rough field assessment can be made by hefting the hive from the back. An experienced beekeeper develops a sense of weight over time, but a more reliable method is to weigh the hive on a scale. A colony entering February should have, at minimum, 25 to 30 pounds of honey remaining if brood stimulation is being considered. If stores are below that threshold, the colony needs carbohydrate supplementation first. It's typically in the form of a sugar brick, fondant, or dry sugar placed directly above the cluster. Protein without carbohydrate is acceleration without fuel. The second condition is weather forecast reliability. This is where historical beekeepers had an advantage they did not recognize as such. They were cautious by default because they could not predict weather. Modern beekeepers have access to 10-day forecasts and historical climate data. Before placing a protein patty, the beekeeper should verify that no extended cold period, defined as 3 or more consecutive days with highs below freezing, is forecast within the following 2 weeks. If such a period is likely, the patty should be delayed. The third condition is colony strength assessment. A colony that is covering 6 or more frames of bees in a standard Langstroth deep has the population to sustain early brood rearing with manageable risk. A colony covering only 3 or 4 frames does not. While stimulating brood rearing in a weak colony in February is one of the most reliable ways to kill it. The small cluster expands to cover brood it cannot adequately warm, and a single cold night finishes the process. The fourth condition, and this is the one most frequently ignored, is the beekeeper's willingness to follow through. A protein patty placed in February is not a one-time intervention. It is a commitment. Once brood rearing has been stimulated, the colony will need continued monitoring. It may need supplemental sugar feeding. It may need a second patty if the first is consumed before natural pollen becomes available. The beekeeper who places a patty on February 1st and does not return to the hive until March 15th has created risk without managing it. The practical protocol for those who determine that February protein supplementation is appropriate for their situation should follow a measured sequence. Begin with a half patty, roughly half a pound, placed directly above the cluster on the top bars. Do not place a full 1 pound patty on a colony that has not yet begun significant brood rearing. The signal should be moderate, not overwhelming. Monitor consumption. If the half patty is consumed within 7 to 10 days, the colony is actively using it, and a second half patty can be placed. If it remains largely untouched after 10 days, the colony is not yet ready to expand, and the patty should be removed to prevent moisture accumulation and small hive beetle attraction. Temperature monitoring is essential during this period. The beekeeper should track not only daytime highs, but overnight lows. The critical threshold for brood survival in an expanded cluster is roughly 40 degrees Fahrenheit as an external temperature. Below that, the cluster must generate significant heat and honey consumption spikes. If a period of sustained cold follows patty placement, supplemental sugar, whether as fondant, sugar bricks, or thick 2-to-1 syrup in an internal feeder, should be provided immediately to offset the thermoregulatory cost. There is a further complication that deserves attention: ventilation. A colony rearing brood in late winter produces more moisture than a broodless cluster. Respiration from both adult bees and developing brood generates water vapor, which rises and can condense on the inner cover or upper surfaces of the hive. That condensation drips cold water onto the cluster. In severe cases, this moisture alone can kill a colony that otherwise had sufficient stores and population. If protein supplementation is undertaken in February, the hive must have adequate upper ventilation. A simple notch in the inner cover, a slightly propped outer cover, or a moisture-absorbing quilt box can prevent this secondary kill mechanism. The geographic variability of this issue cannot be overstated. A beekeeper in South Carolina, where daytime temperatures in February regularly reach the 50s and 60s, operates in a fundamentally different risk environment than a beekeeper in Minnesota, where February can deliver sustained sub-zero nights. The February patty that stabilizes a colony in Zone 8 may destroy one in Zone 4. Latitude, elevation, and local microclimate must govern the decision, not the calendar date alone. Narrow window, wide consequences. Historical records from the 1920s and 1930s, particularly from USDA extension bulletins and state apiary inspection reports, document recurring patterns of early spring colony loss that track precisely with premature brood stimulation. Inspectors noted colonies that appeared vigorous in late February, with visible brood and active foraging on warm days, only to find them dead 3 weeks later with extensive frames of chilled and decomposing brood. The language in those reports is remarkably consistent. Colonies that expanded too early relative to reliable forage availability suffered disproportionate losses compared to colonies that were left unstimulated. This does not mean inaction is always correct. There are situations where February protein feeding is not only appropriate but necessary. Colonies intended for early pollination contracts, such as almond pollination in California, must be at peak brood production by mid-February. In those cases, the beekeeper has deliberately chosen to manage the thermoregulatory risk through intensive monitoring, supplemental feeding, and often migratory placement into warmer climates. That is a calculated management decision backed by ongoing intervention. It is not the same as a hobbyist placing a patty and hoping for the best. The core principle reduces to a single question. Can this colony sustain the brood it will produce through the weather it will face? Until natural forage becomes reliable. If the answer is uncertain, the patty should wait. A colony that begins brood rearing in early March, timed to natural pollen availability, will build up rapidly and reach full strength only slightly later than a colony stimulated in early February. But it will arrive at that strength without having gambled its survival on a 4-week window of vulnerability. The bees have not changed. Their thermoregulatory biology is the same mechanism that evolved over millions of years. What has changed is the availability of protein supplements that can override the colony's natural timing. That override is powerful. It is also, without careful management, destructive. A colony that survives to forage is worth more than a colony that was pushed to grow. If this breakdown was useful, leave a comment with your experience. Subscribe for more historically grounded beekeeping insights.